Another problem the South had was that the Southern generals would oftentimes lead their troops into battle, with the result that 52% of your Confederate generals were either killed or wounded, among them Stonewall Jackson, and among them General Jeb Stuart and General Hill, A.P. Hill. A lot of these generals were either killed or wounded in battle, and this cost the Confederacy also, General Garnett among others. But anyway, after the Confederacy had won several battles, they had won what's called the 7 days, and they stopped the Union advance toward Richmond. They finally decided, okay, we can conquer Maryland. So General Lee picked 55,000 Confederate troops, and Lincoln decided to go once again with General McClellan, whom he had appointed once and replaced. Lee was counting on McClellan not moving, but for once in his life, General McClellan actually moved. What happened was, it's believed that some Confederate officer pulled a cigarette out of his pocket, dropped a piece of paper on the ground without realizing it, smoked the cigarette, and sometime later a Union soldier came by, saw some paper on the ground, picked up the paper and, oh man, I better take this to my captain. It contained the Confederate entire battle plan.
Wow.
And well, the captain saw, the captain took the soldier himself and the paper to General McClellan. So General McClellan had laid out before him the entire battle plan, where Lee was going to be and when, and for once in his life, McClellan got his army to moving. They moved into Maryland, crossed the Potomac River, and they met at a place called Antietam. This was the only victory that McClellan won. Some people don't call it a victory, some people call it a stalemate, but it's a victory in it when the fighting was over, the Confederate army went back across Potomac. So in that regard, it was a victory of sorts. But McClellan was fuming the whole time. He wrote to his wife just how terribly his army was being mauled and how badly he was being defeated. What he didn't know was his men were doing more damage to the Confederacy than the Confederacy was doing to him. And the next one day, after a couple of days of fighting, they woke up in the morning and the Confederate army would not give a battle. McClellan didn't either. Then the next day after that, the Confederate army went back to Virginia. The biggest mistake the Confederacy was to make was in trying to go north. They should have stuck to their plan and stayed home instead of trying to go north. But Antietam was the nearest thing that McClellan ever came to a victory, and something that Lincoln could understand. He said, we had them defeated, why didn't you get up and pursue them? What Lincoln did not understand was that victorious generals in those days did not pursue the defeated foe, owing to the fact that by the time the battle was over, both sides were so badly mauled and the troops were so badly scattered that a lot of the troops were going around, have you seen my outfit? Well, what outfit are you with? I'm with Captain such and such, and oh, we haven't seen him. A lot of troops would find themselves lost from their outfits, and in the confusion of battle, I can understand why a soldier might get dinged, knocked hard in the head, and be knocked out for several hours, and wake up and find out he did not know where his comrades were. Just all kinds of issues, and simply victorious generals did not pursue their defeated foes. And again, this was something Lincoln, sitting in the comfort of the White House, could not understand, but today we do understand it. Even victorious Confederate generals would not pursue their retreating foes, because you have to be organized. If your army is not organized, I mean, you run a risk of marching into a trap. It's been many a time throughout history, and it's even in the Bible, where an army would pretend to be defeated and get the other army to marching out after them, and then they'd be ambushed as they marched. So they didn't pursue the defeated foe. But anyway, that was the nearest McClellan came to a victory, was at Antietam. They continued to win victories. General Stonewall Jackson won victory after victory. I've got to elaborate on Jackson a little bit. I've mentioned him. When I was in graduate school, I did one of my graduate papers on Stonewall Jackson. I thought I was doing a paper on a really good man. It turned out, though, that Stonewall Jackson had some severe, crippling problems. He had no regard for human life. And ultimately, he had no regard for his own, and he wound up getting himself killed by going out in front of his men at night when his men thought he was back behind them, probably asleep like he probably should have been because it was dark. Instead, he wanted his men to keep on fighting, just keep on, don't quit. And he wound up being the man they shot and he died a week later. But he had no, he was too quick to shoot a man, to kill a man. And again, he quarreled, here's what one sentence in the biography for everybody. It said, Jackson quarreled with every one of his fellow officers except for General Lee, who quarreled with no one. He was constantly quarreling. He was very difficult to get along with. And again, I thought he would be one of my heroes, but the more I look into him, and my wife said, this man was a nutcase. She knew that I'd done a paper on him, and she was reading about him one time. But anyway, he won battle after battle until he got himself. He did lose one battle, though. One of his generals under him ordered a retreat because his men were out of ammunition. And if you think that's reason enough to retreat, I think so too. But he said, no, we could have given him the bayonet. He had that general court-martialed. Fortunately for that General Garnett by name, Jackson died before the court-martial came to trial. And then General Garnett tried to redeem himself by marching up a hill at Gettysburg, and he was found missing in action. His rank and insignia turned up later. It's believed that he was buried as an unknown soldier in the graves of the private soldiers. But anyway, but the Confederacy had men like this leading them. They won initially, but in the long run, one of Jackson's famous sayings was, go ahead and kill them all. There's plenty more where that one came from. Yes, but Mr. Jackson, there's not plenty more where you came from. And his Valley campaign, he only had 3,000 to 4,000 troops, never more than that one time. So the Confederate replaced his Valley campaign cost Confederacy 20,000 killed, wounded, captured, or missing. So how did he lose 20,000 to 4,000 men? Because as he lost a man, he'd be replaced. The Confederacy could not afford those kind of losses, folk. The Union could. The Confederacy could not. Anyway, they went to Gettysburg, and this was the biggest mistake that Lee made. Gettysburg is a town in Pennsylvania. When I was 11 years old, my father took a family there, and I'm probably the only one of my siblings who remembers it. But yeah, Gettysburg is in the mountains. Now, if you know anything about the geography, the mountains there are so many of them, bunched so close together, that for several weeks, not weeks, but several days, neither army knew where the other one was. General Meade had gotten wind that the Confederacy was heading north, so he headed north. Lee was heading north, and accidentally some of Meade's men bumped into some of Lee's men and started shooting at each other against Lee's orders. And again, this was a problem the Confederacy had. Now, the Union had no orders not to shoot. The Confederacy did, but they battled out for 3 days in July 1863. At the end of 3 days, Lee realized he was defeated. And here's the mistake Lee made. Lee had his artillery shoot up the hill. Cemetery Ridge it was called because it was a cemetery atop the ridge. The men fired their cannon and missed. Lee could tell that the artillery had done no damage to the Union, but nevertheless he thought, believing his men to be invincible, he had his men march up the hill. There have been to this day men who have gone to that hill and counted the paces and counted how long it takes. The march was a fatal blunder. The Confederacy, some of the Confederate soldiers actually got to the top of the hill, but eventually the Confederacy slowed down, wavered, stopped completely, started to walk backwards, then turned around and ran pell-mell down the hill. And at that point, the Confederacy was lost. Lee never did take the offensive again. The Battle of Gettysburg has been called a turning point of the war. Up until that time, the Confederacy appeared invincible. Oh yeah, one of Lee's generals, General Stuart, was called Undefeated Jeb, J.E.B. Stuart, Jedediah E.B. Stuart. But a general named George Armstrong Custer and his men sent Jeb's men running through the woods there at the Battle of Gettysburg. There was no more invincible Lee. There was no more undefeated Jeb. The Union did lose more men at Gettysburg, but folks, it's not a matter of how many men you lose. You win the battle when the other side leaves the field. Again, the Union could afford the losses. They lost quite a few more than the Confederacy. The Union could afford it. The Confederacy could not. Well, Meade went south. He followed Lincoln, but did not actually pursue him. But he followed Lee. Did not actually pursue him. He followed Lee into Virginia. And then he won nothing after that, particularly. Finally, Lincoln decided, I'm going to promote Grant to be in charge of the whole Union Army. So General Grant, who had won victories in the West, came east to lead the Army of the Potomac and left Sherman in charge of the West. Hopefully some of you know that Sherman went through the city of Atlanta, defeated the Confederacy, and burned Atlanta to the ground. Sherman did make one mistake. He tried to charge up Kennesaw Mountain with the Confederate Army on the top of the mountain shooting down. That was a blunder. Again, Sherman lost the battle, lost more men, but hey, you know what I'm going to say. Sherman could afford to lose. The Confederacy couldn't. Sherman could afford to lose those men. But anyway, Sherman marched on towards Atlanta, crossed the Chattahoochee River, went into Atlanta, and burned the city to the ground. Now, Sherman said, I feel badly about burning this beautiful city, but I know these people, that they will build an even more beautiful city in the place of the one I'm burning down. He was right. Sherman believed in fighting dirty, folk. And that might be one of the reasons that the Union won. War is horrible. War is awful. And I could tell, and I will eventually tell more stories about how awful war is. But it's horrible. Anyway, the Confederacy accused the Union of dirty tactics until Sherman ran into the federal prison, the Confederate prison near Andersonville, where he saw a bunch of Union soldiers starving to death. Nothing remained of but human skeletons. And then Sherman pointed his finger up, actually, you are the evil ones. Look at what you're doing to our prisoners of war. They hung the Confederate man in charge of the prison. His name was Anderson. They hung him. Anyway, Sherman went on to march from Atlanta to Milledgeville, which was the capital of Georgia. And there at Milledgeville, he took over the capital, and some of his men pretended they were representatives, and they voted Georgia back into the Union, unanimously, of course. All Union soldiers taking over the capital, voting Georgia back in. It didn't count, but nevertheless, eventually it counted, oh yes. Then Sherman marched to the sea and burned everything a mile wide in his path, every blade of grass. The idea was to cut the Confederacy in two. And especially what he did was damage. He took up all the rails and got the center of the rails hot. Then his men would make a pretzel out of the rails around a tree. And if you know anything about metallurgy, folk, once those rails were bent, there was no way on earth to straighten them back out. They would have been they were seriously weakened. You would have had to simply melt them and recast them from scratch, which eventually, of course, was done. But the railroad was, for a mile long, was destroyed. And of course, you destroy a mile long railroad, that means the trains cannot possibly get through. He destroyed every bridge in his path, went to Savannah, and said, I'm going to give Savannah as a Christmas present to Lincoln. In the meantime, Lincoln believed he would lose the election of 1864. For the first time in history, we had an election during a war. But thanks to Sherman's victories, and thanks to Grant being able to... Now, okay, Grant did not win anything could be called a victory. Grant engaged the Confederacy at Wilderness, Cold Harbor, and Spotsylvania, 3 big battles, which are called indecisive. In other words, neither side won, but Grant did not stop his march toward Richmond. The Confederacy would engage him. The Union, as usual, lost more in the South, and the Union, as usual, replaced its losses. The Confederacy was getting to where they couldn't. They eventually got to a place called Petersburg. I've been there myself, but Petersburg was the place where all the rail lines going into Richmond went through. The Confederacy had to hold it, so Grant laid siege to Petersburg, and the siege lasted several months. And the Union resorted to trench warfare. In the meantime, Sherman, having marched to Savannah, he said, I'm going to make Savannah pay for leading the way to fighting the war. So he was in South Carolina, of course, once Savannah. He marched through South Carolina and burned it too. Every place that his men went, they burned. He got to North Carolina. He was hoping to join forces with Grant. And it was obvious by now that the Confederacy could not stop Sherman's advance. But Sherman and Grant never quite met up. Lee had decided that he was going to abandon Petersburg and go, and quickly, before Grant could catch on to what was happening, Lee planned to join up with his general who was fighting Sherman and defeat Sherman, and then combine their armies and defeat Grant, or defeat Sherman first, but the plan didn't work. Lee went to pick up some supplies one day in his army and found the supplies had gone to a town 100 miles away, and this was very devastating. And then, one day, Lee received a letter from Grant. Are you willing to surrender? Lee discussed it with his officers, and some of his officers wanted to keep fighting. Others said no. In the meantime, Jefferson Davis, now, if you head south toward Florida on I-75, you'll run into a place called the Jefferson Davis Capture Site. It's down there below Tifton, I believe, south of Tifton. Anyway, Jefferson Davis, to try to escape capture, it has been said he disguised himself as a woman, but some Union troops recognized him anyway. So they picked him up, and President Davis was captured there just in the southern part of Georgia. And the Confederacy was still trying to hold together somehow. All right, now, folks, I have to tell this story. General Grant had a few problems in his personal life. He was a drinker, heavy drinker at times. He also personally was a slouch. One day a bunch of generals got together and went to Mr. Lincoln and said, Mr. Lincoln, listen, the man looks like he hasn't been out of a trench in 20 years. He never takes a bath. He drinks heavily. They told all kinds of stuff on him. Lincoln listened to him and said, I cannot spare this man. He fights. I have learned that wherever Grant is, unlike other my generals, wherever Grant is, things move. Grant stayed. But anyway, Grant was having problems one day with headaches. He had continual problem with headaches. He had muscle pains. He had problems with sleeplessness. Oh, just one after another. But one morning, he put plaster on his head to try to relieve the pain. He'd take medicines such as he had, and he'd resort to drinking even, to try to relieve the pressure, the pains in his joints. But one morning, all the pains left his body. That was the day he got a reply from General Lee. I'm willing to meet with you and talk surrender. Meet me at Appomattox Courthouse at such and such a time. When Grant read that, all of his pains, which really were in his head the whole time, went away. All of his aches, all of his muscle pains, sleeplessness. He replied, these two men communicate by means of a man carrying a white flag, a flag of truce. They would communicate with each other. So Grant sent a letter back to Lee, I will be there. General Lee showed up at Appomattox wearing a general's uniform, all neatly pressed and not a speck on it. Grant went to Appomattox dressed in a private's uniform and basically looking like a slouch, wrinkled and unpressed. You'd have thought that Grant was the loser. The two men met and they reminisced. They'd known each other in the Civil War days. They reminisced about, they'd known each other during the Mexican War days. They reminisced about the Mexican War, and finally Lee said, well, we might better get on with the business. We came here, Grant said, let's do it. So they began to discuss the business. To Lee's surprise, Lee said, my men, it was in April. It's time for the spring plowing. Grant said, let them keep their mules, let them keep their horses. Nobody in our army would take them. Just leave your ammunition behind, of course, but otherwise, keep your horses. All your prisoners, we'll turn them all loose. They'll all go home. And, they discussed it. The terms were really generous. Grant and Lee came out of the meeting. Some of the Union troops started cheering really big. Grant waved his hand, no, we don't want to do that, folks. So it's been a long, bloody fight, and this man here has done really well, fought well. We don't want to insult him. Lee went back to his men and told them the news. His army started to scatter off. Again, Lee was acting without Davis's orders, and this was one of the problems the Confederacy had. Too much independence among their men. There have been many a book written on why the South lost. Anyway, at that point, the war was over. Now, in the meantime, Lincoln had been pushing hard for the 13th Amendment to try to get these slaves freed. And all right, keep in mind, when the 13th Amendment was passed, right, the Constitution says that an amendment is passed when 3/4 of the states, but guess what? 11 of the states did not vote on it. Nevertheless, the 13th Amendment was passed before the surrender at Appomattox. And it was now the law that had been passed by the states that were still in the Union. And they passed a law that slavery was illegal now. Lincoln had signed the Emancipation Proclamation earlier, but that had only applied to states at war with the Confederacy. It did not apply to states like Maryland and Delaware and West Virginia and Kentucky and Missouri. Didn't apply to those states. Nevertheless, the 13th Amendment passed.
Excuse me, sir.
Yes.
When year did the general of the surrender to?
It was in April 1865. The war began in April, the war ended in April. I don't remember the exact date, but it was April 1865. All right, now, folks, here's the bad part of the story. And maybe it's good for news for Lincoln because he didn't have to get his hands dirty like the next president had to on trying to get the Union back together. Getting the Union back together proved in some ways to be harder than keeping it from falling apart. But anyway, Lincoln decided he would attend a theater and relax a little bit.
In the Ford Theater.
Ford Theater in Washington, D.C. And he admired an actor, a famous actor named John Wilkes Booth, and his brother Edwin Booth. Edwin was slightly more famous than John Wilkes. John Wilkes Booth thought that Lincoln was a tyrant. We have a photograph of John Wilkes Booth breaking into the box where Lincoln was sitting with using a little derringer, and he shot Lincoln in the back of the head. Lincoln died the next morning. It is now well known if the right doctor had been on the scene and got to Lincoln, Lincoln might have survived, because this doctor had figured out that a lot of soldiers who had been in the head, if you applied a hot cloth to the wound and kept it there and replaced the hot cloth every once in a while, you could keep a soldier alive even with a head wound. But the doctor who treated Lincoln did not know that. It was a new treatment. Lincoln would have probably survived if he had lived at this time. Now, folks, I'm going to bring this up now. There have been a lot of person research the similarities between the death of Lincoln and Kennedy. Both Lincoln and Kennedy were shot in the back of the head. Both men were shot on Friday. Lincoln was shot in Ford Theater. Kennedy was shot in a Lincoln that was built by Ford. All right, yeah, the car was a Lincoln built by Ford Motor Company. Yes. Now, Lincoln did not, this was told, but we finally had to research, Lincoln did not have a secretary named Kennedy, but Kennedy had a secretary named Lincoln. And Mrs. Lincoln advised Mr. Kennedy to not go to Texas, but Lincoln, it turned out, did not have a secretary named Kennedy. We tried and tried to find it, but it's not in the records. Both men, Lincoln and Kennedy, had a vice president named Johnson. Both Johnsons had been Southern Democrats at one time. Johnson became a Republican, though, because he was a Tennessean who would not, Andrew Johnson, would not leave the Union. When all the senators left, the Southern senators left, he stayed in his seat. All right. Anyway, there's some similarities there. John Wilkes Booth and Lee Harvey Oswald, those names have the same number of letters in them. The two men were born exactly 100 years apart. Lincoln was elected in 1860, and Kennedy was elected in 1960, and both men dealt with the issue of civil rights. Both men dealt with the issue of blacks. And it's a lot of people believe that both men were possibly shot because of what they planned to do with the economy, pay off the national debt using paper bills that was printed bills. Anyway, that's something I always throw in at this time. How much of that would be on the test? Maybe none of that last. But the other, this stuff. All right. The one big accomplishment of the Civil War, it settled two issues. States don't have the right to leave the Union. And folks, that's come up again. California is thinking about leaving, and so is Texas. But the states don't have, the main issue, though, it's settled, was that slavery would come to an end. All right.